Okay, so we'll talk about Reconstruction and its aftermath post-Civil War. What happens to African Americans? Why is it that we went through this time period of disenfranchisement? Why weren't blacks didn't they receive the equality? This is a lot of questions that a lot of my students have, and hopefully this will answer some of it because this is probably pretty understudied. But I would argue that even today, in today's climate, this is a very important time period for us to really, really understand. Okay, so moving on here, 1865 is the end of the Civil War. And the reality of it really, the Civil War is from 1861 to 1865. This time period is known as Reconstruction, and it's going to end in 1877. So that's important because we do have a time period in which blacks are gaining some rights, but it is going to end in 1877, and we'll talk about that, okay? Constitutionally, there are 3 amendments that are passed. Very easy way to remember these, okay? The 13th Amendment, which freed the slaves. The 14th Amendment, which gave them citizenship rights. And the 15th Amendment, which gave black males the right to vote. So look at this very carefully. Freed citizens vote. Easy way to remember it. Free citizens vote. 13, 14, 15, if you're ever wondering or trying to remember which amendment was which. So, blacks define freedom as white freedom. Like when they get their freedom, they're expecting the same kind of freedoms that white people have. That's their expectations. They wanted the ability to hold meetings, to have religious, services without white supervision. They wanted the ability to own dogs, believe it or not. They couldn't own dogs because they could be used as weapons, guns, liquor. Family was at the center of the black family. They wanted to create churches, and they want education to be paramount and important because blacks absolutely knew how important education was to the advancement of their society and their communities. So this is a picture of a black church that came up after Reconstruction. And regarding the other equalities, there was an organization that was established by the government called the Freedmen's Bureau, and it's just like it sounds. It was there to serve freed men, the recently freed men, okay? And it goes until 1870. It does end then, but it established schools. It gave aid to the poor, like medical aid and just physical aid too. Any kind of disputes, and this is what this picture is, between blacks and whites was settled by Freedmen's Bureau people. It was supposed to try to establish equal treatment in courts for African Americans too. And although it had like a pretty hefty thing on its plate, the Freedmen's Bureau, it does make quite a bit of progress with education and healthcare, but it isn't that successful in the other areas, okay? One of the areas that blacks never get is they never get land. They're promised land at the beginning, but that is something they never get. Here's an image of a freedmen's school. Another image of the Freedmen's Bureau, or actually this looks like they're getting some handouts there. This is an image of a freedmen's school in South Carolina. Like I said, education was incredibly important. I will also tell you that the people, a lot of the white people that are running these freedmen's schools encountered quite a bit of violence because the people in the South were, as you can imagine, very unhappy about this. All right, so a new kind of economic system comes up during this time period called sharecropping. Essentially what it was is that families were given a small plot of land in order to exchange and in order to gain crops, okay? They were given a small part of land, and this was not something that they owned. They would technically just rent this and then split they would split the profits with the plantation owner. A lot of times, a lot of the people that did this sharecropping system ended up on the same plantation or didn't leave the same plantation that they were slaves at. They were just part of a new sharecropping system, which is kind of crazy to really think about. So this is an image of sharecropping in the South. You can see, where it really was, where, cotton was before. And this is an image of, before the Civil War. And so this is the Burro Plantation, and this is after. So essentially what happens is instead of living in slave quarters, they got their own homes and they got to, have their own plot of land, and they would earn some profits. But a lot of these plantation owners were very abusive about this. A lot of them still beat the slaves, or the former slaves, I'm sorry, that were on the plantation. A lot of them would only pay them in something called plantation money, which I always equate to, like, it's almost like monopoly money. They had a store on their plantation, a plantation store, and they could only buy things, tools, food, things like that at their plantation store. So essentially they were almost, it was just a fancier way to enslave them. And so, this is under a lot of criticism, but this is the system that they had. Politically, we had a new president because Lincoln was assassinated, by the name of Andrew Johnson. And he has his presidential Reconstruction plan that he puts together. It lasts 2 years. It's a horrible, horrible failure. Let me just say that. Johnson was incredibly racist. And some people really have a hard time, like, why would Lincoln make him his vice president if he was horribly racist? And the real answer to that was that Lincoln's idea was that he wanted to bring people together. Johnson was from Tennessee, from a border state, and he thought that bringing somebody in like that would help heal the nation, okay? I don't, think that he's actually rated probably one of the worst presidents. I'd argue probably the worst president ever. Okay, he was impeached, which, you'll talk about when you get into 1302, or if you're in 1302, you'll talk about it soon. But essentially, he's deeply racist. He favors Southern whites, and all of his programs are obvious to that. The South is enacting ways to try to hold down the former slaves, and Johnson turns a blind eye to that. And so because of the failure, radical Republicans, like Thaddeus Stevens here was one of them, Sumner was another, they take over Reconstruction until its end in 1877. They were really big abolitionists, and they place military districts to force the whites into submission of the Reconstruction laws that were in place. And, radical Republican because they were radically Republican, or, at least as defined during those times, okay? When it ends in 1877, this is what really relinquishes the protections for African Americans, okay? But keep these dates in mind, and I'll talk about why Reconstruction ended here in just a little bit. But you can, we're going to talk a little bit about President Johnson and his, what happened during that time period. So during Johnson's presidential Reconstruction, the South began to enact laws that essentially restricted the freedom of ex-slaves. They did have the right to marry and own property. However, they couldn't testify against whites. They couldn't serve in juries. They couldn't serve in state militias. They couldn't vote. They had to sign labor contracts, or you could be arrested. So if you didn't go work on that plantation that you used to be a slave at, you would be thrown in jail. Okay? This is going to end in 1867 when radical Reconstruction takes over. But this was a horrible time. This shows you the South, they could not put back together put back together their country without being racist and try to hold African Americans down. So these are the Reconstruction military districts. You can see Texas was part of 5 there, but they essentially were occupied until 1877. So they're occupied, kind of forced into giving African American rights at that time. During this radical Reconstruction, during this time period, African Americans are able to hold offices. Now, blacks were mainly Republicans, okay? White Republicans controlled, like, the state parties, held most of the political offices. But in South Carolina, for example, they had a majority of black office holders in the state. Because remember, at the time, South Carolina actually had more blacks than whites at the turn of the Civil War, or at the start of the Civil War. And so there are a lot of black people that are controlling the legislature in South Carolina. 2 blacks were actually elected to the U.S. Senate and 14 to the House of Representatives. So you have 16 of them elected to federal offices. And you also have to keep in mind that many blacks were serving at a local level. And so it wasn't locally, statewide, and federally that a lot of African Americans were able to hold offices for the very first time. This is also the time in which you see a huge amount of what we call a reign of terror occur. The KKK is first comes about during this time, okay? At first, they were kind of local and organized, but almost immediately, a former Confederate officer by the name of Forrest Bedford creates the Ku Klux Klan when Republican governments kind of take over. And several enforcement acts were passed by Congress in order to stop the KKK from this reign of terror, kind of outlying terrorist groups. And this is, by the way, Ulysses S. Grant by this time is president, so he's really pushing for this. He's very much for African American rights. Any kind of acts that deprived the citizens of their civil and political rights were seen as federal crimes. So those enforcement acts that were passed by Congress, and of course this is still the radical Republicans, were crimes. And just like I mentioned, Ulysses S. Grant sends troops to actually stop KKK terrorism, okay? We start to see lynchings, and this is the rise of the KKK. And I will tell you that the KKK, and we'll go into much more detail in this in 1302, but the KKK will have moments in U.S. history of resurgence and non-surgence also. So the North begins like towards the late 1870s, like mid to late 1870s, begins to retreat on this protection of African Americans. Okay? There are a lot of racists in the North, too. Okay? They claim that there's misgovernment due to black rule, which is really racist. The Democrats won elections in 1874 in the House, and that's going to make a big downturn for black rights in particular. Also, our buddy Stevens and Sumner both die, our big radical Republican pushers for that, okay? And they really die out. And on top of that, adding to that, there was an economic panic in 1873. So Republicans who are already focused on economics to begin with turn their focus on economic issues, and they kind of push away African American rights by that time. And finally, we get to the bargain of 1877. So Rutherford B. Hayes was running against Samuel Tilden for president. It ends in a tie, which means it has to go to Congress to break the tie. And the Republicans make a dirty deal with the Democrats, saying that if you let us keep our boy in, Hayes, we'll end Reconstruction. And it was a horrible thing to happen. We'll pull out the troops out of the South, no more occupation. And the Democrats were like, we'll take it. And so they still controlled Congress. The Republicans were going to have the presidency, and African Americans were completely left out. Okay, and this is going to be the beginning of the end of their rights, of what we call a disenfranchisement, which is where their rights really end. Okay, so some talented blacks kind of avoid politics during this time. And they become businessmen, lawyers, preachers. There are black communities, and there's many middle-class blacks that prosper just in their own kind of communities. There's also some organizations like National Association of Colored Women, the Press for Women's Rights. Sadly, there were many women's rights organizations at this time, because remember, women do not have the right to vote yet. That won't be until 1920, 100 years ago. But essentially, a lot of the organizations, women's suffrage organizations, excluded black women, as horrible as it is. And so a lot of them formed their own organizations. Some blacks continued to vote even in the wake of violence. Okay, so I do have a couple of video clips. One is from a movie called The Free State of Jones, which is an amazing movie. I recommend that. And that kind of shows you the violence that they would face if they tried to vote. So, I encourage you to watch that video clip here after that too. Okay, so now we're going to see something called disenfranchisement. This is where a lot of students get confused. Okay, if they had the right to vote, then why weren't they voting? Why did it take until like 1965 in the Voting Rights Act for African Americans really to be able to enjoy full voting? Well, after Reconstruction ends, okay, the southern states, kind of like the black codes at the beginning of the Civil War, or the end of the Civil War, start to do things to disenfranchise blacks' ability to vote. They start enacting laws called poll taxes, where you would have to pay a poll tax, so you'd have to pay a tax in order to vote, which excluded most African Americans. There were also literacy tests, And literacy tests are pretty horrible, guys, okay? These literacy tests are impossible for anybody to pass, and they only give them to blacks to pass them, okay? Also, the person that decides if you're going to pass or not usually was a white person that was running the voting behind there. The other thing, and this actually does get outlawed at the beginning, essentially it enacted something called a grandfather clause, said that in the South, if your grandfather had the right to vote, then you had the right to vote, which obviously meant that all blacks couldn't vote, okay? So that actually does get ruled unconstitutional, but poll taxes and literacy tests will continue all the way until 1965, almost 100 years. Okay, by 1940, here's a number for you, only 3% of adult blacks were actually in the South were registered to vote. Then we also enter into some laws of segregation. Notice the dates on this, okay? 1880s, railroads, theaters, hotels admitted blacks and whites, and others didn't, okay? There's a landmark case called Plessy versus Ferguson, which essentially, there was a man named Plessy, and he tried to get onto a rail car, and this was done very intentionally to challenge these segregation laws, and he was arrested. It ends up going all the way to the Supreme Court, and unfortunately, in a vote of 8-1, no kidding, okay, 8-1 in the Supreme Court, they said that facilities could be separate as long as they were equal. You know that didn't really happen. We know the facilities weren't equal. But what's really disturbing about this is that the vote was 8-1. The one dissenter was a guy named John Marshall Harlan. Harlan High School is named after him. And he was a dissenter saying it was an atrocity, okay? But anyway, this is going to continue all the way until 1954 when it's overturned by the Brown versus Board of Education case. And if you're taking 1302, you will hear about that case, okay? The other thing that begins to happen is we start to see lynchings, okay? Some lynchings were done in secret and some were not. Let me just define lynching. That's like the vigilante act of punishing a black for a crime that had not gone before court and had his day in court of, okay? Most of these lynchings were because of wrongly accused black men accused of raping a white woman. There was very much this idea of a black rapist that permeated from the South, this fictitious myth that they created in order to scare people into not wanting to give black people rights. The reality of it is that under no cases of lynchings have I ever seen any evidence that the man actually committed the rape. As a matter of fact, even today, 90% of rapes are race on race. And so, you know, the reality of it was it would probably never happen. All of these black men that were hanged for this, were innocent, okay? So it took activists like Ida B. Wells, and if you're going to take 1302, you'll learn more about her. She becomes like a big anti-lynching crusader. And while lynching was happening, we couldn't really call ourselves, you know, the land of the free, right? All right, to wrap it up, Civil War ends in 1865. Reconstruction goes from 1865 to 1877. African Americans did enjoy some freedoms during that time. There were some that became office holders, but federal protection of blacks ends in 1877, which disenfranchises many of the blacks, most of the blacks, almost all the blacks in the South. Okay, so these disenfranchisement, segregation laws, all these things don't even change until the 1970s, which will really blow a lot of students away by this, okay? But, okay, so that introduces 1302. It also ends 1301. So hopefully you learned quite a bit from that, and we will talk to you soon.